Okay, thanks, John. Good morning. Yes, our title is Rail Efficiency, Cost Research and its Implications for Policy. I've been around a long time. I did my first benchmarking study of railways in 1977. I didn't know it was benchmarking then, but it clearly was. In those days, I didn't use any econometrics, and I was very sceptical of the value of econometric studies of efficiency for railways, because the techniques seemed to make lots of assumptions that just didn't apply to railways. Two things have changed my mind. One is, I think, there have been enormous advances in the techniques for examining efficiency using econometrics. And the other one was being joined by Andrew at Leeds, who actually understands how to use these techniques. So we're going to be arguing that econometric analysis of costs has an important part to play in measuring rail efficiency and in judging the success of policies. As you'll gather, I'm doing the introduction. Andrew is then going to tell us about how to use econometrics to measure efficiency and talk about some of the studies he's done on Britain. I'm going to come back and talk about something that we did on European rail policy more generally and draw conclusions. So, background and introduction. As you know, the European Commission wants to see rail playing a much bigger role in the transport system in the future as the main mode of medium-distance passenger and long-distance freight transport. That undoubtedly requires big improvements in efficiency and is only affordable if costs are greatly reduced. The Commission is relying on reforms to increase within rail competition as the main way of achieving this. In this context, it's very important to, A, be able to identify efficient railways and learn lessons from them, and that's the first big use of efficiency studies, the benchmarking aspect. But secondly, also to be able to identify what reforms work in what circumstances, and that's the second big use of efficiency measures in railways at the present time. There are lots of particular problems in measuring railway efficiency, which I think Lou brought out in his presentation, so I can be quick here. But certainly continued monopoly in many areas, and in Europe, in fact, most of the world outside North America. Strong government intervention in terms of outputs and prices mean that methods like looking at profitability, which might be useful in competitive markets, can be very misleading in rail. What is generally, although not always, in the hands of railway management is the achievement of cost efficiency, although even here there may be political interventions. Problems of measuring inputs, Lou discussed already. Adding together lots of different types of vehicles is adding apples and pears. But one particular problem that I'd like to bring out affects measures of labour force, and that's different degrees of subcontracting. As always, Britain is an extreme here. At privatisation, all infrastructure maintenance and renewals were placed in separate companies which were sold to big private sector contractors, and that staff just merged in with their staff working on roads and all sorts of other things. So from published data, it's now very difficult to actually find out how many staff were involved in rail infrastructure maintenance and renewals. And there's a similar trend to a lesser extent in terms of rolling stock maintenance, cleaning, looking after stations, even selling tickets. So big problems there which affect measures of labour force, but hopefully are all still there in the cost data. And that's one main reason why we much prefer to work with cost data rather than physical measures. Okay, even on the cost data, there are problems. Things like capital grants, capital write-offs mean that there's no consistency in terms of measures of depreciation and interest, and that really needs attention that we've not been able to give it to date. A host of different outputs. A passenger kilometre of commuter service is very different in costs from a passenger kilometre of long distance service. A tonne kilometre of coal is very different from a tonne kilometre of containers of manufactured goods. Again, this point was made already in the first paper. This plus the fact that in European circumstances, to a large extent, railways are actually producing services specified by government, either central or regional, so that it's really train kilometres that railways are being commissioned to produce rather than passenger kilometres, means we have a preference for using a variety of measures of output, even if you can't disaggregate as much as you would like. If you've actually got passenger kilometres, freight tonne kilometres, train kilometres, ideally distinguishing different types of train, vehicle kilometres, ideally distinguishing different types of vehicle. They all contribute to our understanding of the output of the railway. I think actually one of the studies Andrew is going to refer to had all three of those, but vehicle kilometres is often a difficult one to get hold of. And of course, you need to take account of differences in service quality and the operating environment. So what we need then is a technique, we think, which analyses costs and can take account of a variety of measures of output and other factors which differ between railways. Now comes the difficult stuff, so I'm going to hand on over to Andrew to tell you how to do this. It's that one forward.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm glad that I've persuaded Chris of the value of econometric analysis. I'm not sure I've persuaded him of anything else over the last 10 years working with him, but anyway. I want to start by looking at the methods and then looking at how those methods have been applied in British reforms. And I'll start by saying I do believe efficiency can be measured, but I don't underestimate the challenges, and hopefully that will become clear from what I say. I'll start very quickly with some definitions. There are different types of efficiency. Technical efficiency is about, are you minimising your inputs for a given level of output? And if you're looking at that in an econometric framework, which is what this presentation is primarily focused upon, then that involves estimating a production function. Allocative efficiency is about, are you using the inputs in the right combination, given input prices, to minimise cost. That's important in railways, of course, because railways don't always have control over all their inputs. They can't close lines just if they want to. Cost efficiency is the overall impact of both of those, technical and allocative. And of course, regulators, policymakers are interested in cost efficiency because that's how you get costs down, by eliminating it, and that's how you get subsidy down. Okay, I would also say productivity and efficiency are often used interchangeably, but there are some important differences, as we'll see in the subsequent slides. Now, thinking about how we might develop a methodology for measuring efficiency, let's think about where we might start. Analysts, policymakers, business people start and are familiar with unit cost measures. So cost per track kilometre, cost per train kilometre would be examples. They're useful measures, but they are partial measures. So whilst the cost, the numerator, supposedly covers all the inputs, the denominator is only covering one aspect of what might be thought of as some kind of output, say train kilometres or tonne kilometres or track kilometre. And in railways, as you'll be aware, you get hugely different answers if you're comparing railways, whether you look at cost per train or track kilometre. Now, the econometric approach, and to some extent data envelopment analysis as well, which I'll talk about, allows you to get beyond that problem and derive an efficiency measure which takes account simultaneously of a whole range of measures, track kilometres, train kilometres, and a whole other range of cost drivers. So the advantage of this approach, I believe, is it gives you a single, more definitive, robust measure of relative performance, provided your model is good and your data is good, and so on, for measuring efficiency. And an added benefit, particularly of the econometric method, is that it not only tells you an efficiency score, it tells you how do costs vary with train kilometres, which is important for track access charges, for example. It tells you, have you got economies of scale or density, which tells you something important about how you should structure your railway. I'll illustrate very quickly with this slide. You could think about measuring unit costs, and the implication of measuring unit costs is that you believe the efficiency frontier essentially is a straight line, and you might see this line here as representing best practice. So there may be a range of firms, let's say, who are aligned along the line there from the origin as representing the lowest unit cost. You look at firm A on a unit cost basis, and it appears to have high unit costs, and therefore it's apparently inefficient. However, if you were to estimate an econometric model using the data, you might find actually that there are some economies of scale or density, which mean that the shape of the frontier is actually more like that, in which case firm A actually turns out not to be inefficient. It turns out to be on the efficiency frontier. It's simply a small firm and not able to benefit from economies of scale. Okay, and that, I think, highlights the difference between productivity and efficiency, because there could be productivity gains from moving along that frontier to gain economies of scale, but nevertheless, from an efficiency point of view, all firms along the frontier remain efficient. So what else to say about the econometric method then? It allows us to estimate this kind of cost function, which can be quite flexible, so it doesn't have to be shaped like that, it could be shaped the other way. The model will tell you what the shape is. It allows you to take account of not just train kilometres, but also track kilometres and other cost drivers. So you could have train kilometres on the axis, or track kilometres. Obviously, this slide shows a two-dimensional approach, but the idea is that you draw this frontier effectively in multiple dimensions. So overall, then, the econometric approach is allowing us to explain costs based on a whole set of drivers: the size of the network, the type of traffic on the network, the electrification, multiple track, a whole range of measures characterising what railways are like and how they differ, and then also taking account of random error in the model or in the data, produce an overall measure of efficiency. I will briefly comment on the benefit of the statistical approach compared to data envelopment analysis, which is another method you may have come across. One of the main benefits is that the statistical method allows you to separate out random noise. Data envelopment analysis treats all deviations from the frontier as inefficiency, which may be unrealistic. Importantly, though, DEA also doesn't give you this information about the variability of costs with respect to various dimensions. And I think that's important in gauging the credibility of your model. If you can produce elasticities or cost variability proportions with respect to different outputs and characteristics that are believable from an engineering perspective, I think it gives you confidence in the efficiency results that come out of the model, but you don't see that in DEA. Okay, this final slide on the methods then, simply to show that when you tend to use physical input measures, you're looking at a production or a distance function or data envelopment analysis. When you're looking at financial data, then that involves estimating a cost function, and for some of the reasons Chris mentioned, we tend to adopt the cost function approach as being most appropriate for railways. Now I'll move on to discuss how some of these things have been applied, can be applied, looking at how we've used them in studying British rail reforms. I don't think I need to say too much about background to the British rail reforms, other than to say it was a big bang, full privatisation, full competition, separating infrastructure from operations and privatising and then regulating the infrastructure manager. Subsequently, the infrastructure manager went bankrupt and so on. I think people know the story. The question is, what happened to costs? And the expectation would be surely that where you introduce competition, where you privatise and introduce high-powered incentive regulation, that surely costs would come down. That hasn't been the case. I'm going to talk briefly about train operating company cost modelling work that we've done just in one slide, and then move on to infrastructure. I can't cover both in the time available. So, what happened with train operating company costs? Well, essentially they went up from around 4 billion to 6 billion over the period since privatisation, and on a per train kilometre basis, this rise was about 15%, and that contrasts sharply with what's happened elsewhere in rail franchising in Europe, where typically costs, or at least subsidies, have come down by 20 to 30%. A whole range of reasons, I think, partly to do with the size of our franchises and the way we do franchising. We've also used some low-powered arrangements, cost-plus type arrangements, for dealing with operators in distress, which has damaged efficiency for a time. But there's no clear signs that costs are coming down substantially. So there's been a big cost increase. It's not clear that even with competitive tendering or re-tendering having occurred more than once, still costs are not coming down. On the question of economies of scale and density, there is evidence that our franchises may be too large, operating at diseconomies of scale. On the other hand, there's a problem. If you split up franchises, you potentially increase the number of overlaps and cause a loss of economies of density. So it's not a straightforward question about how you structure franchises. And another important point that came out of our work actually is that the ability to exploit or lose economies of density, depending on how you structure your franchises, does depend on service heterogeneity. It may be you can't always exploit economies of density if actually the services you're running down the same route are very different. And I simply refer you to those papers if you want further detail, but I ought to move on to talk about infrastructure if I'm going to leave time for Chris to touch on European reforms. So not a terribly positive story from franchising, at least on the cost side, though, as we saw earlier, big growth in demand. Now, rail infrastructure costs likewise have seen substantial growth. At a total cost level, unit costs up by 45%. That's quite, I should say, a little bit of an overstatement in one sense, because it includes enhancements, improvements to the network. If you were to strip that out, then what I've called here OM&R, that's operating, maintenance and renewal costs, have increased by about 7% per train kilometre. So the cost of sustaining the existing network in its current form, if you like, has still gone up per train kilometre, which, given the substantial economies of density and the huge growth in traffic, one would have expected quite a substantial reduction in cost per train kilometre. So this is quite, again, not a terribly positive story. If you were to go back a few years, it was even worse, and the Office of Rail Regulation has been putting Network Rail under a lot of pressure to get its costs down in recent years. So actually, where we've ended up here in 2013 is considerably better than where we were in 2004, and that's partly based on the study that I'm going to refer to next. So, as John mentioned earlier, back in about 2008, ITS did some work working with ORR. It was an international benchmarking study. It used UIC data, but not published UIC data, but a data set referred to as the LICB, Lasting Infrastructure Cost Benchmarking Data. 13 infrastructure managers over an 11-year period. And I just want to show you the results. Firstly, to point out a point I made earlier, which is that one of the advantages that you get is you get some parameter estimates. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but you can interrogate the fact that the elasticity with the cost with respect to the route length is about 1. which suggests constant returns to scale, and the elasticities on the next two variables are less than 1, indicating economies of density. And those are believable results, and you can interrogate those and ask, do they make sense from the previous literature and from an engineering perspective? And that's something that I think is a big benefit of this approach, because it then hopefully gives you more confidence in the rest of the results. This next slide shows an indication of what you get from an efficiency study. This is the efficiency score for Network Rail. An efficiency score of 1 means you're efficient, 0 means you're very, very inefficient. And the other factor clearly at play in this diagram is that you get not just an efficiency score for 1 year, but for several years. And Network Rail was showing a deterioration in efficiency, as indicated by the huge cost increases, and at the end of the period had a 40% gap against the best practice in the data. And essentially, ORR took that gap, made some adjustments to it to try to reflect some uncertainty and so on, and supported it with other evidence, bottom-up studies, and set Network Rail that target over a 10-year period. And Network Rail has challenged this analysis, but they've, I think, accepted the scale of the gap. Okay, and this, I think, shows the benefit of panel data as well. So you're not just comparing across countries, but you can compare over time, and that allows you to separate out inefficiency from unobserved factors. There are various methods, new methods being developed actually all the time, which really help us to do that. Even if you don't have data to capture the heterogeneity, you can still model it. A bit of a turnaround. I've just got 3 more slides, so I think I'm hopefully okay to hand back to Chris. If we go to the 2013 review, so that's 5 years later, again, we did some econometric benchmarking working with ORR. We were more supporting them this time now on a technical basis, with more being done in-house. But this showed a gap of about, this is working now, of about 13% to 24%. But now, actually, Network Rail, ORR, turned the analysis round and decided that they would focus more on bottom-up studies. So they found from the bottom-up studies that the efficiency gap was about 16 to 20%, and they used the econometric work as supporting evidence. And there are various reasons for that we can perhaps discuss in the discussion. An important development I want to simply refer to, it was mentioned by Torben earlier, what's the level of aggregation you should use. One approach that we've tried, and I think this has got great potential going forward, is to recognise that infrastructure managers have a regional structure usually. And that gives you 2 benefits. One, if you can get the data at the regional level, then you can really expand your number of data points for analysis. Secondly, it allows you to look at what you might think of as systematic differences, say between France and Germany or the UK, but also then regional differences within each country. And those two things are both interesting and important, I think, for regulators. So my final slide is just to point to the challenges. There are substantial challenges. Clearly, you need good quality data that's consistent over time. You need, ideally, a large number of data points, which relates back to my previous slide, that getting that may involve looking at a lower level of aggregation. It's very hard to collect your own data set. It's going to take many years. ORR had the advantage that LICB had already collected one. We did try with ORR to collect some of our own data, and that was successful to some extent, but it requires a lot of commitment over time, consistent commitment from the industry, which I think is hard to achieve. How do you deal with lumpy cyclical capital costs? This is a problem not just in rail, for all economic regulators, and there are different ways of dealing with that, but you have to deal with the problem that if you double your renewals, clearly your costs are going to go up, and that's not necessarily inefficiency. Final 2 points. It's really important to get as many variables into the cost function as possible, and in particular, I think a gap is measures of quality, and that's a problem. But as I said earlier, there are methods that allow you to capture some of that unobserved heterogeneity without necessarily needing the data. And the final point is something we've worked on a lot at Leeds, is there is still uncertainty. You get an efficiency measure, that measure contains some uncertainty, and you need to recognise that in the way you use the analysis. So at that point, I think I'll hand back over to Chris.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, I want to very quickly give you an overview of some work we did at the European level, European and indeed with some non-European countries in the study. And that's the Eves Rail study for the Community of European Railways, which was published a couple of years ago. The background to this has been mentioned several times. Sorry, thanks. The big issue has been whether there should be complete vertical separation or not. And that was one of the key issues that we wanted to address in this study. If you didn't hear before, it's the Eves Rail study which we undertook for the Community of European Railways 2 years ago. When we reviewed past studies, we found there are a lot of studies, there's only some of them listed here. They use a wide variety of methods, different years, different countries, and reach a wide variety of conclusions. There's no agreement, even sometimes between pieces of work by the same authors, in fact. The most recent work was that of Mitsutani and Uenishi. This was cost-function work. It did, we think, address a lot of the issues we've raised, and it did try to look at what works in different circumstances by looking at the interaction of the reforms, particularly with traffic density. So we thought this would be the best study to build on, and we actually worked with Mitsutani and Uenishi. The project was led by Didier van der Velde, who took charge of the qualitative work, the interview side of it. In terms of the econometrics, well, what did we contribute? We added Britain to the data. Most previous studies had left Britain out as being too difficult because the data is scattered around for Britain. We updated to 2010 wherever we could. A starting point was still the UIC data, but because we were working with CER, we were able to feed their members the data and ask them to check it. So in a number of cases, they did point out errors in the data or misunderstandings about what it covered and put them right. We tried to allow more thoroughly for the different ways in which the railways of different countries had been reformed. So we distinguished between the holding company model, complete vertical separation, and continued vertical integration. We improved the modelling of market opening. We had data on when market entry really happened in freight. There are many countries where in principle it was possible, but in practice impossible for many years. And we did have some data on the degree of entry into passenger markets, which was virtually entirely via competitive tendering. I think in 2010, there was no country where open access operators provided as much as 1% of the train kilometres, although that's now increased in some cases. And we got better data of when things happened. So we had 26 OECD countries, 1994 to 2010. I won't go through all the variables, but basically we had these measures of different structures of the railway and different positions regarding competition, and we had a set of control variables, route length, critically, degree of electrification, obviously input prices, as in any cost function analysis. Key findings then. Well, one that certainly surprised us was passenger and freight market openings seem to have had no statistically significant impact. I should say, okay, fair enough, the degree to which the markets had actually opened was limited, but there were some countries, and Germany is actually one of them, where there had been substantial entry. There were a few countries which had significant amounts of competitive tendering in passenger. There were certainly some railways where new entrants had 30% or more of the freight market. Horizontal separation of freight from passenger did substantially reduce costs, perhaps because that tended to be associated with privatisation of the freight operator, and certainly the process of selling off the freight operator led to a concentration on what resources did it really need, how could it be more commercial. At higher traffic densities, vertical separation increased costs. Mean traffic densities that left them pretty much unchanged, whereas the holding company model appeared to have a small reduction in costs associated with it, but that was only significant at the 10% level. A higher share of freight in total revenues increased the costs of vertical separation. So on density, it seems plausible that at high densities, the problem of optimizing the system as a whole becomes more acute than at low densities. Even in Britain, where we took quite a lot of efforts in track access charges and performance regimes to ensure that there were incentives to optimise the system. The McNulty study, which was mentioned earlier, concluded that misalignment of incentives was a very major problem, and we think that's the cause of this problem. At low densities, actually vertical separation seemed to reduce costs. The importance of freight, well, in the passenger sector, you have a timetable and you run it for 6 months or a year, and that's it. But with freight, what actually runs changes day to day, and that, we think, may be a reason why separating infrastructure and operations for freight is more difficult, because you're perpetually having to optimise the system on a daily basis in terms of what you're running. So, concluding comments, we think the econometric approach to efficiency measurement has strong advantages. It allows for multiple outputs. It produces a single measure of efficiency. Now, people have said that doesn't make sense anyway, but I think both in benchmarking and certainly in understanding the impact of reforms, it's extremely helpful if we know what the efficiency gap is. Okay, once we know there's a gap of 40% or whatever, then you've got to start digging down in a lot more detailed data to try to understand why that's come about. But I think having a single measure is valuable. It controls for other differences between railways. It allows for random noise in the model. But the big problem, one thing I think everyone's agreed on, is we need better data. Specifically on the reforms, I think the evidence we've put before you is very mixed, that reforms seem to have worked in some circumstances but not in others. And that means I think we need a pragmatic approach to looking at what works in what circumstances. We're not going to come up with a single solution which is ideal for every set of circumstances. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Chris and Andrew. I'll now open up the floor for comments and questions.